we wanted to begin by asking you about the Anthropocene. It's a key reference point in your work, and for those not familiar with this concept, could you explain why this is a concept that needs to be wrestled with? It's fairly contested, and there are a lot of debates. And what is at stake in thinking about this concept?
Oh, what's at stake? The future of the planet, I suppose, and life on it. I guess that also depends on which side of the debate you come down on. So maybe I can start with the first piece of that, which is just to sort of give a little bit of a primer on what I mean when I say Anthropocene. And I think I share that with many people, although as you signaled, there are big debates on this topic. The Anthropocene is the word that's used to denote effectively a new geological age, where human influence is dominant from pole to pole across the planet. The reason that the place to start with is that to think of it as a geological age is that part of the way that that scientists have recognized that is to look at like stratigraphy, to look at layers of rock in the Earth's core and see that there are periods of recent history that in geological terms that where human influence can be identified by the signatures that are left in rock. What's interesting about this term is that it has expanded far beyond the field of geography, I think because it's such a suggestive heuristic for the period of environmental disruption that that we're seeing and living through now. There have been big debates about how one should define the Anthropocene and where you should put the start point. Some people, a sort of starting point was in some of the early articles about this written by social scientists was CO2 emissions. So thinking about, from the Industrial Revolution to the present, this period when there has been such huge pollution released into the atmosphere. The start point that I feel convinced is useful as a sort of social, sort of because it refers to social history as well as environmental history, is the period around and immediately following 1492, so the period where European contact with the Americas started in a really big way, which led to a genocide proportion die-off of the indigenous peoples of the Americas due to largely to introduced diseases. So, a 90% reduction in the population of the Americas in, I think, the 50 to 100 years following that point of contact. And two geographers, I think, from the University of London have argued that you can look at, there's actually an atmospheric geologic signature that comes from that event, from the reduction of agricultural production and the reconversion of formerly agricultural land to forest land, that marks that event sort of as it unfolded over time. And that, to me, I think is really a poignant way of thinking with depth about this period of climate change that we're all experiencing, and reminding ourselves that this didn't start 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It started 500 years ago. And it started not just with major processes of environmental change, but also huge social injustice and dislocation of pre-existing lifeways. There are lots of debates about whether or not the idea of the Anthropocene puts the focus too squarely on humans. And I think you can make an argument either way about that. There are some people who say, well, the problem with this is it sort of reifies humans as the only thing that is important in terms of our influence on the planet. I do think there's a way of thinking about the Anthropocene and thinking about humans as a disaggregated group that can help us think more carefully about both environmental and social injustices and where they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. So this, because in the natural sciences, periodization tends to start in the 17th or 18th century. So what's at stake in this alternative periodization, this longer historical arc that you're offering, seems to me to be pointing more carefully at a different set of root causes, or at least pointing at root causes in a different kind of way, but also looking at asymmetries of sort of responsibility. Maybe you could talk just a little bit more about that.
I think that's an astute observation and quite fair to say. Eh, so maybe to bring it forward a little farther, a way to think about a point of reference for this is in current debates about who should take responsibility for climate change. So in the UN, the Conference of Parties, the around the climate change agreement, one of the arguments that often comes up is that there should be common but differentiated responsibility, meaning that those who have polluted the most and who've had the chance to develop through that pollution should also be more responsible um, for forestalling the impacts of climate change, whereas developing countries that haven't contributed as much to the historical pollution that has released all this CO2 into the atmosphere should have less responsibility or less stringent responsibility or less stringent controls on their emissions. I think what thinking with this earlier periodization of the Anthropocene helps us see is that those unequal contributions to environmental harm that we're experiencing now and that we're debating now, they stretch back to you know, colonialism. They stretch back to the periods of empire, European empire, or you know, the new empires of capitalism that have been going on for quite a long time. And you could probably, you know, you could say that 1492 to some extent is an arbitrary point because some of these patterns of power differentiation, you know, they extend farther back into history beyond that. But I think there is a strong argument to be made that that's a meaningful tipping point.
Mm-hmm.